Today, I'm very happy to host the last installment of our lecture series, Empires and Intellectuals. It's been a 5-lecture series, and I'm delighted today to have Cemil Aydin as the final speaker. Cemil Aydin is professor of history at UNC Chapel Hill. He's written a couple of very important books, one, the latest being The Idea of the Muslim World, A Global Intellectual History, from Harvard University Press in 2017, and also his earlier work, The Politics of Anti-Westernism in Asia, Visions of World Order in Pan-Islamic and Pan-Asian Thought. Today, Professor Aydin is going to speak on the topic, Ottoman Intellectuals on the Empire Question during the long 19th century. We'll have about half an hour presentation by Professor Aydin, and then we'll have some time for questions and discussions, about 30 minutes following the talk. Thank you very much for joining us, Cemil. The floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you, Brett, and thank you, Sona, for organizing, and thank you to the University and Mediterranean Studies Center. So today I was thinking that since you are a graduate school, mostly, I will do more of a historiographic overview of the question of empire from the perspective of the Ottoman intellectuals, and do this in a way to kind of synthesize recent scholarship on what that empire was in the 19th century Ottoman Empire, how did the intellectuals try to imagine it, and why it ended. With one particular question is that we are getting to closer to this anniversary of the end of Ottoman Empire, and in some ways, you know, it's already 100 years past if you take the defeat in World War I, but it wasn't a defeat necessarily. We are getting to the anniversary of 1923 Lausanne Treaty, when the Turkish Republic emerged out of the ashes of the Ottoman Empire in some sort of post-Ottoman state. But when the Turkish Republic emerged with the Lausanne Treaty, and then soon afterwards, not only ended the Ottoman dynasty, but also this temporary 1.5-year period spiritual Ottoman Caliphate. A member of the dynasty was kept as a caliph until March 1924. Initially, this was seen as kind of a rejection of the Ottoman past by a pro-Western Turkish nation and nationalism. But there is also a lot of writing on 1923 from the perspective of the Ottoman struggle for sovereignty and equality and international law. And many of the Turkish lawyers and historians of international law depicted Lausanne as a eventual fulfillment of the Ottoman elites and Ottoman intellectual wish to gain recognition as a sovereign political entity, and a way of going back to the moment of 1856, where in the Paris conference after the Crimean War, the Ottoman Empire was considered a member of the concert of Europe. And this 1856 Ottoman membership into Europe was then presented as an unfair exclusion of the Ottoman Empire from the European Imperial Club, and a struggle for the Ottomans to make sure that they go back to the club as an equal member. And many of the Turkish historians, on the one hand, presented Lausanne as their triumph, as a success, that eventually this Ottoman effort was fulfilled at Lausanne. But on the other hand, there is, of course, an irony that what Turkey achieved at Lausanne as being accepted as an equal member of that imperial club came at the expense of actually getting rid of the empire on some ways, so that this, even though the Turkish historians presented Lausanne as a return to the imperial world, that they were once part of it and excluded afterwards, a European imperial world, but that once the Turkish nation was in it as a member, again, as a kind of post-World War I imperial world, it didn't have any of its Balkan provinces, Arab lands, and its own 20 to 30% Christian populations of Anatolia, the Greeks and Armenians. So the Lausanne also confirmed the expulsion of the Armenian population, and then with a side note, also created a more systematic population exchange that reduced the number of the Greeks to an insignificant minority in return for Muslims coming from the Balkans. So what I was planning to do is to think of this 1856, or in some ways 1839, the Ottoman elites attempt to create a third Ottoman Empire. And according, if you take Bakitezcan's suggestion that there's a first and a second Ottoman Empire, refashioning an Ottoman Empire as member of a European imperial club. If you take that as 1839 process, bring it all the way to 1920 and ask this question: is that why did the Ottoman Empire end? Was that a failure of the imagination within, or is that a result of the tragic accident of World War I? That the Ottoman Empire ended because of the inter-imperial conflicts of World War I and afterwards. And that leads to this question: is that what is an empire? How do empires legitimize and justify themselves? Is there anything unique about the Ottoman Empire in that regard? Let me do some sort of a broader argument, so that if you don't, I'm going to try to finish in 30 minutes, but if you don't get to all the way to the end, at least you know one of the main arguments. So one main argument relates to the book I wrote that Brett mentioned on the idea of Islamic world, and it has something to do with the Caliphate as well. The story of the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century is often presented as a dual conflict between Ottoman Empire's obligations to Europe, to the West, represented by pro-Western, so-called the pro-Western Tanzimat elite, and its obligations to the Islamic world and Mecca. And the assumption is that the Ottoman Empire was an Islamic empire, but out of its necessity and its survival, it tried to belong to the new imperial club of Europe, but it was torn. So the Ottomans were torn between Mecca and Vienna, you can say, or the center of Europe will be maybe London. And they couldn't balance these two. So the assumption is that until Abdulhamid, at least, they were more committed to a sincere way of refashioning the empire, and according to principles of modern rules of norms of civilization and progress, and giving, especially proving themselves by giving non-Muslims certain rights and privileges. But then with Abdulhamid, somehow the Muslimness came out of them, and then they were interested in an Islamic internationalism and the Caliphate, and the World War I became the clash of these forces, in some ways with the Young Turks going back to Abdulhamid by declaring holy war against the West. And then only after Republic, then the assumption is that the Turkey went back to this pro-Western Tanzimat form of reform. My argument in the previous book, which I could make it even further, is that actually pan-Islamism and the Caliphate was an extension of Tanzimat. It wasn't to reject Ottoman Empire's claim to membership in the European Imperial Club. It wasn't to reject the Ottoman claim to the status of an empire. In fact, the Caliphate under pan-Islam was about creating a leverage and empowering leverage to actually assert Ottoman Empire sovereignty and equality in international law. So the Ottoman Empire became more Islamic as it was trying to be a member of the European imperial order. So that I will go into the details of this argument, why 19th century Ottoman Empire, in the story of the 19th century Ottoman Empire, in fact, the Islamic part, the so-called the Caliphate part, and the pro-Western reforms, pro-European reforms were actually complementary rather than contradictory. This leads to me to then conclude with some sort of a broader reflections on the nature of the European Eurocentric international order and its legacies, in the sense that if we then see the connection between 1856 to 1923, we may also need to see the nature of that 50, 60 years defined by the Eastern Question, which is considered a process of racializations of the Ottoman Empire, a process defined both by European Orientalism with regard to Muslims, but also in response to Ottomans utilizing a kind of Muslim modernism to assert that the Muslims are modern, and that's why they can be equal in international law. And to see the long-term legacies in the sense that perhaps the Lausanne Treaty of 1923, which claimed to be a solution to the Eastern Question, with the minorities' rights regime, tried to handle some of the legacies of that international governance of empire and minorities inherited from the Eastern questions of the Ottoman Empire. So I also think that the way the Ottoman Empire ended, the way that it transitioned to the League of Nations minority regime and the Lausanne could also tell you that there are things happen in this process, which is not only about the Ottomans, but also about the contemporary problems of global governance and minority rights. So let me then briefly outline how I get to this argument. For that, I need to first make a suggestion. When Brett said that my paper had to do something with the Mediterranean, and since Ottomans actually had a presence in the Mediterranean, it was very easy. But there's also one other aspect of this, is that in some ways the Ottoman 19th century is defined by the power of the Mediterranean over Ottoman links to Asia, the Mediterranean and Europe, Ottoman links to Asia, Central Asia, as well as the Indian Ocean. What I mean by this is that the Ottoman Empire was not an Islamic empire secularizing. I think this is one of the biggest misconceptions about the nature of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans were always part of the European imperial system. They did not need Tanzimat or the Islahat reform 1856 to assert their Europeanness. This empire had a long period of relationship with other European empires, going back to multiple centuries. So if you go back to the classic definition that the Ottomans were very proud of after the Crimean War in 1856, when it was declared that the different European empires, they say each on this, to respect the independence and territorial integrity of the Ottoman Empire and guarantee in common the strict observance of this engagement, and will in consequence consider any act tending to its violation as a question of general interest. This is the part of the Paris Conference with regard to the Ottomans. This was seen as an expansion of the European norm of sovereignty to the non-European world. So a lot of people consider this as a turning point, almost a way of universalization of European norms of sovereignty, almost 100 years before that universalization happened, let's say in Africa, when Ghana became independent. So I do think that the historians of international history, the global norms and global governance should look at this Ottoman, 100th century Ottoman background, while they're also trying to understand the 20th century globalization of norms of sovereignty and good governance. The mistakes that I think we often make is that we think that there was an Islamic empire trying to convert to a European empire. In reality, this myth has to be deconstructed by not denying that the Ottoman dynasty was Muslim. Islam was very important, but we have to define in what way it was important, how, and how it actually became more important during the 20th century. We have to be more comfortable with the multiple dynastic legacies of the Ottoman Empire that included, obviously, the Muslim one, as well as the Central Asian ones that is characterized by the Khan title of the Ottoman rulers, going back to Genghis Khan. Irrespective of what they actually say about the Genghis Khan, we cannot deny that there is a Turco-Mongolian, Persianate imperial legacy that shaped the Ottomans. And the colleagues who worked on 15th, 16th, 17th century attest to the details of this. There's, of course, I really like Baki Tezcan's suggestions that perhaps in the 18th century, as the Ottomans became more democratized, that came with the restrictions on the absolute power of the Sultan, which is some sort of a Mongolian universalist power of the Sultan. Perhaps with that democratization, the role of the Islamic law and the Muslim public opinion might have increased, but that's never 0 to 100 or 100 to 0. We have to be more comfortable with this multiple legacies of the Ottoman imperial identity. What I found fascinating in the 1860s and 70s and 1880s, when the Ottomans were stigmatized after Paris Peace Conference as being the sick man of Europe, with the Eastern question, that an empire that tries to be part of the progress civilized empires, but not capable of being that because of its Muslim oppressive side over Christianity or Christian minorities, as part of a global governance. In its apologetic response, the Ottoman elites had to respond to Orientalism, and I think the generation of the young Ottomans, for example, have to emphasize that Islam is compatible with modernity. And then you can be Muslim and have a good governance with meshweret and parliament and a constitution. There is a clear Islamic modernism merging with that kind of imperial universalism. What I found it fascinating in this regard is that at this moment, I guess because of the power of the European intellectual categories of Islam and the West and Islam and the modernity, the Ottomans do not make enough of their more complex imperial backgrounds, the Persia-Mongolian imperial background. It's not easy to, of course, to say that I inherit universalism from Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan's reputation itself wasn't very good as this kind of Mongolian horde, according to the European racial assumptions. But I think this was a unfortunate turning point, because when the Ottomans were trying to be part of the concert of Europe, there was no concert of Asia. There was no concert of Islam either. There was no Islamic international, Asian international order. We could formulate perhaps in the 16th, 17th century, when there were multiple post-Mongolian empires, the Mughals, Safavids, and the Ottomans. We could have imagined that there was indeed a non-European world order based on this imperial universalism. And I'm very glad to hear that my colleague Aisha Zarakol at Cambridge actually publishing a book on this idea of an alternative international order based in Asia before the Westphalian international order. Because that international order has its own values and its own sophistication of governance of diversity, is rather secular in some ways, because all is equal under the rule of a universal emperor. So there were my suggestion, partly inspired by Aisha Zarakol's suggestions, that there was a good imperial traditions that the Ottomans inherited, but then they were embarrassed to talk about this, or they didn't. They strategically thought not to talk about this, and then instead talk about Islam and its compatibility with the civilized European rule. So in that regard, I talk about the kind of in the process of the reinvention of the empire, Ottoman Empire in the 19th century. At least there are multiple moments, but two moments are very important. So one of them is the pre-young Ottoman moments of invention of empire. These are the moment of the early Tanzimat. I once worked on a journal named Mijma-i Fnun, which is published in 1862 and 1867. No discussion of Islam and the West. The elites who published that journal, that include not only Muslims, but also Greeks, Jews, and Armenians, are very civilizationist. They believe that there's one universal civilizations, there's one imperial international law, and Ottomans is a good empire that can belong to that civilized imperial order. That maybe it can be seen as Mustafa Rashid Pasha, Sadr Rifat Pasha, Munif Pasha. They are all part of that civilizationist reinvention of the Ottoman Empire, as well as all the non-Muslims who believe in the empire, who work for that. The irony of that moment is that the moment that the Ottomans were very civilizationist, they were categorized by Europe as semi-civilized, or not enough civilized, or uncivilized because they are Muslim. And that will lead to this Gladstone moment of, symbolized by Gladstone's moment of describing the Ottomans as this anti-human specimen of humanity and oppressive of Christianity. And the young Ottomans is actually then struggle with that moment's intellectual challenges to assert the civility and the civilizational compatibility of Ottoman Empire's Islamic tradition. It's in that context there is a debate on the Ottoman Empire globally as well. We know that Wilfred Blunt's The Future of Islam, even though I say the future of Islam is partly about the Ottoman Empire, after the Ottoman defeat against Russia, and the military defeats are important, some people thought that it will not survive in the north, in the Balkans, and maybe even Istanbul. There were actually suggestions even by the so-called the friends of the Ottoman Empire, like Golds Pasha, who argued that there should be an Turkic Arab Muslim empire, perhaps with a capital city in Konya or Damascus. So there is some sort of the global debate on the Ottoman Empire, thinking that it can't be European, or if it's going to survive, it has to survive outside of Europe, even before the Ottomans lost the territories in Europe. So this is what I call the kind of Ottoman Empire 2.0, and it's in that context the pan-Islam and the Caliphate was introduced, not to actually deny the deal reached at the Paris conference, kind of an internationalized Ottoman Empire. And a deal reached in the Paris conference confirmed with the Ottoman Constitution of 1876 is that the Ottomans are becoming more democratic, more constitutional empire, eliminating discriminatory taxes on Muslims, even though equality has not been reached, becoming a civilized empire. I think that's the deal. But at the same time, internally wise, while these reforms were happening, there's a discourse that Muslims are incapable of achieving this. And after the Russo-Ottoman wars, there's more of a depressive outlook on the future of the Ottoman Empire, that is going to fail. That's kind of a decline narrative. It's in that context the Ottomans further internationalize the question of their sovereignty instead of rejecting that internationalism. The internationalization of the sovereignty works in the sense that the Eastern question tied to Ottoman constitutionalism reform and its membership into Europe as a segment to its reforms over non-Muslim populations. So they're kind of the Eastern questions that the Armenians and the Greeks, their conditions will improve, has to improve, otherwise there will be an intervention into Ottoman sovereignty. As the response, Ottomans added two dimensions. One is this connection of the spiritual caliphate to India. So there's a kind of imperial assertions through the caliphate to the domains outside of the Ottoman Empire. And it seems this was initially done by non-Ottoman Muslims. They were the ones who were coming to the Ottomans for their own reasons. So you can read my last book on this issue. What were they thinking, the Indian Muslims and others? But Ottomans use it to gain leverage, right? So if the Eastern question is allowing European empires to intervene in the Ottoman affairs by in the name of protecting the Christian populations, they made these shy and timid efforts to assert the ties to Muslims all over the world, to say that I am not an ordinary empire, that I have people with interesting Muslims all over the world interested in my survival and my dignity. And in that regard, it may seem ironic that once Mustafa Kemal sent last Ottoman Caliph Wahdeddin to exile, one of the things he did is quite interesting. Once the kind of the empire of Khans and Padishah is ended, he wrote a letter to the American president asserting that, this is a very unjust abolishment of the dynasty because as the Caliph of all the Muslims in the world, he's not going to give up on these rights, and America should support Wahdatin in exile. So we can see how also the Ottoman dynasty's credentials and the global reputation also changed in that process, moving from Khan and Shah to the Caliph. But the initial intention is actually further internationalizing the question of Ottoman sovereignty through Caliphate and pan-Islam. There's a second aspect to this Caliphate, one aspect extended to India and Indian Ocean versus the Mediterranean, since we make reference to the name of the center. Another aspect is actually using the Caliphate for the Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire. So as our colleagues with a recent book by Osama Makdisi showed, that despite the massacres of 1860, the Christian Arab massacres of 1860, post-1860, Arab publics actually became very Ottomanist. So if we want to think about Ottomanism, we have to also take it away from Istanbul and Namik Kemal and the Turks to think that why Arabs were Ottomanist, what kind of empire they imagined. We also know even the Greeks and Armenians. I think there's a good dissertation about a good book will come out of Madeline Elfenbeis on this question of non-Muslims and the Ottomanism coming soon, I hope. And so the Caliphate and the pan-Islam with regard to the Arabs may seem unnecessary because Christian Arabs kind of redefine their Christianness, and the Jewish Arabs too, is loyal to the Ottoman Empire, but it seems to be continuing to be very important all the way to 1920 to 23. Even after the Ottoman defeat, there were ideas of an Arab-Turkish federation to kind of reinventing again the Ottoman Empire in a smaller way, just Anatolia and the Arab lands in the form of a confederation. It's almost like a United States of Caliphate was the kind of one of the last things that people were talking in terms of preserving the Ottoman Empire. With these reinvention of the Ottomans, we might also think why this deal collapsed during and before, during, and after World War I, when the Ottoman sovereignty and imperial identity was so internationalized that once the war started, it started in a former Ottoman zone of Bosnia. It has something to do with the Muslim reforms and the post-Ottoman period, clearly. Once the Ottoman entered into World War I, they used all of that internationalized debate, the crisis of imperial identity and the governance, by doing multiple things that seem paradoxical but seem complementary, right? That on the one hand made an alliance with Germany representing Europe again to assert their belonging to the European club of empires, but on the other hand with Germany using Caliphate in a direction that has never been done by declaring jihad against the European empires. So what we do know is that at that moment also World War I also symbolized that a kind of a Balkan failure of the Ottoman Empire coming to the kind of to Anatolia with the poisonous policies of the Armenian expulsion, and that lead to the genocide in World War I by CUP. Then after the war, there's an attempt to redefine that empire without, despite what happened in World War I, in a new form, in a more national form, in conversation with Wilsonianism, self-determination of the Wilsonianism, and to reinvent the Ottoman Empire in alliance with the Bolsheviks as an anti-imperialist empire, or anti-imperialist struggle from 1919 to 1922 to 23. So once the Ottoman Empire fully ended with the Ankara government abolishing Ottoman dynasty and then the Ottoman Caliphate, my conclusion is that I think this whole legacy from 1856 to 1923 does not disappear, both in terms of its historical memory, in terms of its identity, but also its legacies for both the modern Turkish Republic, broader Arab publics and the Muslim publics, as well as the broader global governance of sovereignty and minority rights. Maybe I had a paper, I didn't read all of it, but maybe I read one conclusion is that, so 1856 is seen as a kind of a crack in the exclusionary standard of civilization discourse that limited the boundaries of international order to Christian white European powers. So 1856 Ottoman inclusion into Europe seems like a turning point in that regard, the kind of expansion of Eurocentric international society, its universalization. But then after 1856, the Ottomans appeared in the international discourse as a sick man of Europe that required Christian humanitarian intervention and as a site of incomplete civilization standard. Here, I think we know from the recent critical scholarship that yes, Ottoman Empire did have domestic problems of governance. In fact, this is what Nama Kemal and the young Ottomans were indicating, and they were trying to solve that problem. But these problems wouldn't make them an exceptional empire. That well, comparatively now we know that the problems that Ottoman empires had is not unique. America had problems with race. Europe had problem with anti-Semitism. All the empires had all kind of different problems. It doesn't justify, of course, the bad governance or the oppression that Ottomans had on their minorities. But I think with that kind of a comparison, we then see the internal Ottoman constitutional struggle to make the empire work for different groups, to make the empire governance better, with the international imperial governance identified with Eastern question, and also with the League of Nations minorities regime, with Lausanne as being one of its turning point contracts. So I guess I wanted to have more of a question and an answer. Just to conclude, what I will say is that I'm very impressed and pleased with the recent good scholarship on Ottoman Empire. I think, as someone who is now aging, I'm very impressed and proud of the young generation doing really great comparative work. And I think that comparative work then has to be translated into the public memory debates that we have today about the Ottoman past. So as the scholarship on the Ottoman Empire gets more complicated, unfortunately, the historical memory of the Ottoman Empire in different domains get worse. It's partly because of the TV shows and many other political ideological moves. So we may need to bridge this gap. While we are bridging this gap, I think we may offer more clarity to contemporary debates and issues. And these include so-called neo-Ottomanism that Turkey at some point promoted, and it seems like they're giving up on it. But also the question of the historical memory of World War I, the sufferings in World War I that we went through last week, the situation of the Syrians and refugees in Turkey, but also, last but not least, the crisis of the international order and the international governance. They're all interlinked. There is not a single, there's not a simple story of the failure of the Ottomans to fulfill its standards of European imperial governance. We know that the European governance itself had its problems, which then transferred to the League and the United Nations. And paying attention to how the Ottoman imagination of empire interacted with the crisis of the imperial governance globally might actually teach us some important lessons for understanding today's issues of governance that is clearly seen in the refugee crisis of the Middle East and beyond. But I'm going to stop here because I talked to Brett and I said that we should leave more time for question and answers rather than I read my whole paper. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Cemil. A lot of food for thought, some provocative arguments you put forward. We already have some questions here that have been presented, but if you do have a question, you have two options. you can type them in the Q&A box there, or you can also raise your hand and ask the question orally. If you've already typed your question in, then and you want to ask it orally or elaborate on it, then I can also allow you to speak if you raise your hand. Okay, so the first question we received is from Cengiz Güneş, and the question is, Cemil, can you see these or not?
I can see them, yeah.
You can, okay. Yeah, we're nationalists, pro-Western or pro-advancement. Because many Islamists were supporting the English mandate, while nationalists were claiming full independence. I think the distinction we made.
Thank you, Cengiz. Sometimes we confuse the cause and effect. So I think what we consider as kind of a Turkish nationalism is part of a negotiation that continued from the defeat of the Ottoman Empire from 1918 all the way to Lausanne Treaty and the abolishment of the Caliphate, perhaps. In that regard, the CUP, the government, the Young Turk government, they were still trying to keep and preserve an empire while redefining it. I think they wouldn't have thought of losing the Arab provinces. If Arab provinces stayed with the Ottoman Empire, then it wouldn't have been a Turkish nationalist one. So that's one example. I think the nationalism is more of a byproduct of what came out as part of this very intense internal transformation and the negotiations at the end. So we do know even like as late as 2021, Ataturk was in touch with Arab revolt leaders. They almost forgiven that when Faisal was in Syria. They were still talking about some sort of a plan to work together with the Arab and the Turkish majority provinces in the north. The pro-Western and pro-advancement question is very interesting, is that once Lausanne happens, it's a very good question, is that even though the Republic felt secure, because there's no capitulations, there's no extraterritoriality. So with Lausanne achieved all that late Ottoman goal of eliminating unequal treaties, extraterritoriality. And then Lausanne also eliminated the need for an Islamic modernist apologetic defense of the civility of the empire, because you define yourself as a Turkish nation. But Lausanne, at the same time, defined Turkey as a Muslim majority nation. So by making this kind of Christians as a minority whose rights are defined, you obviously say that the majority have to be a Muslim. I think the question of Westernism, Easternism comes after Lausanne, around mid-20s. In some ironic way, Turkish elites still felt insecure in a kind of Eurocentric international order. And that insecurity kind of might have given them the historical memory of how the Ottomans were excluded from membership from Europe because of their Muslim identity. And there are other reasons too. I think once the Caliphate is abolished, it's kind of a strategic decisions. So by Westernization, Turkish elites thought that they could feel more secure. There's some sort of a cultural foundation to the international order until 1950s and 60s. It's still a very Christian, white international order. And as a kind of a Muslim majority, a nation state, and your Muslimness is confirmed with Lausanne. I mean, Lausanne made Turkey a Muslim majority nation. There is still some sense of the fear that comes from being the terrible Turk, unwanted, hated Muslims. So I think Westernization can also be seen as a way to defeat that anti-Turkish, anti-Muslim public opinion in Europe by almost like converting to the Western civilization. I will leave it that way. Otherwise, Ottomans were as Western as modern Turkish Republic. I don't think Turkey was. I mean, Western in quotation mark is in Ottoman Istanbul, and had. Yeah, I don't even want to go into the detail. This is a city that looks like European cities in some ways, with mosques, and you can add that, with a population of 30% of the populations were non-Muslims. Great trade, great connection to Europe. Brett, do you read the questions? Or yeah.
Sure, sure. I think we could just get down to a question from Michael Batalia. And the question is, I was wondering if you could talk about efforts to reestablish greater centralized control over the Arabian Peninsula, particularly the two holy cities, as well as Iraq in the period from 1870 to 1900, particularly in order to bolster the claim to leadership of global Islam. How are Ottoman intellectuals commenting upon or conceptualizing this effort?
Thank you. There are other questions, but I like this question. Let me answer this one, and then you pick which questions I answer. This is a very good example of the importance of Mecca and the pilgrimage and the Ottoman Muslim identity. Obviously, the Ottoman Empire at some point ruled all the prime real estate of all monotheistic religions. So you get the Jerusalem, Najaf, Karbala for Shiites, Mecca, Medina, and the importance of these cities increased. The pilgrimage to Mecca increased 10 times just from 1830s to 1860s and 70s, from moving from approximately 10,000 to 100,000. And the significance of Mecca doesn't increase because Ottomans are becoming more Muslim. 1869, there's a citizenship law. So that means everybody is equal citizens irrespective of their religion. The Mecca's significance increased because of the steamships of the British Empire that gave the infrastructure, the number of Muslims visiting Mecca from other European empires, and the issues of international governance that actually created in that context. And one of our colleagues, Michael Christopher Lowe, wrote a very good book. Another one on Jeddah by one other colleague. So we have two good books on Mecca and Jeddah in just the last year. And that shows that Mecca became a site of international governance. It almost the Eastern question that is dealing with the rights of Armenian and Greek minority in, or population, I wouldn't even say minority, in Anatolia is extended to the governance of Mecca too. And there's some less known stories that actually Muslims who were proud to assert their spiritual loyalty to the Caliph while visiting Mecca, whenever they had issues with Ottoman authorities, they could also use the British or Russian consular offices in Jeddah to ask the empires to protect them against the Ottoman authorities and the Sharia. So the Mecca itself also became an issue of an imperial governance, and the Ottomans had to find a way to assert their sovereignty in these areas. I think they were more annoyed by Muslims utilizing capitulations and the protection of the consulates than they were used to seeing Christians doing that. But the one final point is that I think now we were assuming by reading people like Kawakibi, who said that maybe Caliphate should move to the Arab lands and it should become more democratized with this council in Mecca. We were assuming that there was this kind of an Islamic Arab rejection of the Ottoman rule. I think the evidence is in the opposite direction, that as Mecca's importance increased, also the Arab cities' importance increased. It didn't make the Ottomans weaker. It actually made the Arab publics be more invested in the Ottoman, a reformed Ottoman rule over their populations. It's a very complex question, but I can only indicate how much exciting new scholarship is happening on this issue of Mecca and the late Ottoman Empire.
Thanks. We have a question from Berkay Tunçer. It says, how did you assess the legacy of the young Ottomans for the early Republican period with regards to the attempts to reconcile Islamic culture with the requirements of modern citizenship and patriotism?
Yeah, absolutely great question. So if you want to think about an imagination of a good Ottoman Empire with parliament, constitutionalism, diversity, it's done by the young Ottomans, right? So in the 1860s and 70s, Tanzimat was already reforming the empire, but it was seen as a top-down process. And I highly recommend you reading some of the good recent work by Alp Eren, Madeline Elfenbein, as well as and Osama Maktisi about this generation's achievements. So looking back, you can say that the young Ottomans reflect some sort of a Muslim bias, right? They're being in America in the Black Lives Matter, you can say, well, these good liberal Muslim Turks, how much of privilege were they willing to give up, right? And so did they use their privilege to give up their privilege at the expense of others? That's a good question. So you can always say there are limits to how much of Turkish-speaking Muslim eliteness they will like to give up on. But given the fact that there was a constitution, I mean, without Abdülhamid had to suspend it, or did suspend it with the excuse of the war and others. But the constitution and the parliament was a reflection of the young Ottoman efforts. The only thing is that even the young Ottomans later on inspired this kind of late Ottoman Muslim nationalism, it's clear that they didn't really imagine an Ottoman Empire without its Christian population. So, the friendship between Theodor Kasap and Namık Kemal is a good indication. And we know that so many of the young Ottoman publications were actually published by Armenians and Greeks. And we can imagine them also being a part of the young Ottoman generation. So the critiques of empire by the Arabs, Muslims, Armenians and Greeks have to be seen in conversation with each other, and would be mistaken to see the critique of the Ottomans by, let's say, by Namık Kemal as a critique within the empire, and every critique by Armenians and Greeks as a critique to reject the empire. Some of the critiques by Armenians and Greeks are also reformist critiques. We can see they may be disillusioned, but let's say a recent book by Bedros Matosyan on the 1908 revolution, the Armenian revolutionaries and their disillusionment, shows that yes, but they were part of the Young Turk coalitions. They believed in reforming the empire. So they were also following the young Ottoman generation of making empire a better empire for them. Their disillusionment is a different question. They think that after 1913, young Turks kidnapped that project, hijacked that project. They don't see them being loyal to the 1908 principles. So I think I went into other areas, but I don't also, when we talk about the young Ottomans, I also don't want to make that it's a more diverse group that included non-Turkish speaking, non-Muslim Ottomans as well.
We have a question from Eugene Yashchuk. It is, did Ottoman intellectuals somehow reflect on the Eastern question? Although it was mostly a European concept, it seems to be widespread throughout the continent.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I will say that after 1860s and 17, every single Ottoman intellectual actually is talking about the Eastern question. This is an Eastern question is a form of racialization of Muslims through the Ottoman imperial failures or Ottoman imperial attempt to reform itself. My last book talks about this racialization of Muslim question. It takes different forms in India. It takes different form in French colonies in Africa, how they deal. But so French colonies in Africa say that if you believe in Sharia, you cannot be French. So everybody can be French as long as they give up on Sharia, right? But that means that it's impossible for a Muslim, if they are fasting or they are not eating pork, if that means they're following Sharia, they cannot be French. That's one form of racializations. In India, we know that the debate on Muslims, because they're Muslims, they can never be loyal to the Queen, and then all this Muslim modernist response to, no, we can be loyal to the Queen. So the question, like Namık Kemal's refutations of Renan, all the other Ottoman intellectuals' refutations of them being categorized as semi-civilized, non-European, is actually an engagement with the Eastern question. Eastern question is the #1 question of Ottoman intellectuals broadly. But I could also say that there are traps to this in the sense that they thought that they could gain respect, avoid stigma, reform the empire, gain equality by just talking. I mean, talking works. You can say, look at Nehru and Gandhi. They talk. They do. You don't always have to fight, but talking doesn't always work, right? The generation of Mustafa Kemal and Young Turks said that these Tanzimat elites thought that they can save the empire by just talking, by diplomacy. So the young Ottoman Muslim modernism is an engagement with Eastern question and to dispel the European Orientalism and racism. There's a very good recent book by Zeynep Çelik. It's actually an anthology that came out of Koç University Press. It's titled The East Doesn't Know Us, The Şark Bizi Bilmez. It's all about the European writings, the Ottoman intellectuals responding to European writings on them, on Eastern question and racism towards Muslims. Yes, that's the number one question, I assume. When you think about the Ottoman intellectuals and empire, Eastern question is always there in their mind.
Cemil, I wanted to ask kind of question about the ethics of empire in the late 19th century. Was there any internal reflection among Ottomans about the ethics of maintaining colonies, of ruling either Muslims or non-Muslims who didn't necessarily want to be ruled? I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about the ethical imperative that informed these intellectuals. Thanks.
No, just a great question, Brett. I mean, there are so many aspects of it. So there's one book I highly recommend by Mustafa Minawi. It's about Ottoman scramble for Africa. And there, for example, he describes on the Ottomans trying to use the Berlin Congress rules about the colonization of Africa, saying that I have territories in Africa, Ottomans were part of it, and they were trying to expand by using some of the rules of the Berlin Congress. Let's say you can go from Libya to Chad by using the hinterland rule, or you assert your colonies and your territories in Africa. And of course, Mustafa is misunderstood by Turkish nationalists. They thought that he's thinking that the Ottomans were no different than the French scramble or European scramble for Africa. He's actually saying the opposite there. He says that the Ottomans thought that they could use to defend their possessions. And there is some sort of an ethical way of saying that some of the Muslims are better to be ruled by us rather than European colonialists. And I think the literature on Arab Orientalism Ottoman Orientalism on Arabs is also revised in that regard, is that yes, there is some sort of a imitated colonialism treating the Bedouins as a group to civilize, but there is an ethical concern also to protect their dignity. But with regard to the Christian minorities, I mean, we do know that they keep writing petitions. Let's say if you're an Armenian, you're mistreated locally, and then you write petitions. There's always to the empire or to patriarchate, saying that, I am subjected to this unfair treatment. The empire should come and protect me and give me my rights. So there is some sort of a struggle for certain minorities to challenge the empire, to ethically to treat them equally. In that regard, some of the young Ottomans seems like indicating, like Nama Kemal, saying that, look, it's complicated. So Nama Kemal's position is that it's complicated. It's not only the Armenians and the Greeks. Muslims are also oppressed by the same people. And they make this comparison that if an Armenian makes pay, say 50 kurush, I forgot the numbers, every year for İane askeriye, so you make some money so you don't serve in the military. If a Muslim wants to get out of the military, they have to pay like much more, 10,000 kurush. They have to pay one time the bedeli askeriye. So like, this is unfair. If some people pay much less, they need to serve in the army too. So they argue that there is some sort of Christians are become more privileged. But there is some sort of a ethical confusion, right? What are the duties of empires for all of its subjects? Are they fulfilling them? If they're not fulfilling them, do we have a Turkish Muslim bias in them not fulfilling their duties as a good governance mechanism? And I think that chaos leads to the World War I, and we have this, Arasya Angelik, this kind of Armenian communities publishing house, publishing really great work on some of the memoirs of Armenian officers in World War I, and the Cevijian memoirs is important. This is the man who is serving in the Ottoman army, but then his family is subjected to torture and moved. And you can see the kind of crisis that you're loyal, you do your ethical duty, loyal to the empire, but then the empire mistreats you. So, there are all kind of contradictions of that empire, especially during the war conditions.
Thanks a lot. So we have a question here, which is kind of related to your earlier comments about the Tanzimat, about the pan-Islamic campaign being a kind of extension of the Tanzimat, which is, I think, one of your more provocative points. But here we see from Cemil Aydin saying that some say the Tanzimat reforms eventually led to the abolition of the Caliphate, and that these were futile reforms. This might give weapons to conservatives who say that post-18th century reform did little to help, and so forth. So what do you have to say about this kind of argument?
I will say, look, the modern conception of Tanzimat, Caliphate is a product of Tanzimat. It's not the Caliphate of the Ottomans from Abdulhamid Khan is not the Caliphate of the Abbasids or the earlier Caliphate. It's a very different Caliphate. It has something to do with the extension of the Eastern question to all the British colonies, right? The Indian Muslims are very important. And then this Caliphate is popular because it's modern. So there's one incident during the 1877-78 war. It's the British who suggest the Ottomans that they send a delegation to Afghanistan. So Hulusi Efendi sent to Afghanistan saying that we are Ottomans and the British are against the Russians. So they asked the Afghan king, can you support us against Russia? And Afghan king's response is that I am very honored that the Caliph sent me a delegation. They utilize that Caliphate. But it's the British who occupied my territory. It's not the Russians. So why should I fight with them, right? So in the early Caliphate, there is some sort of British interest to use the Caliphate to justify its rule in India. They might regret it later on, but the Ottomans are also using the same thing to say that because of Caliphate, Britain and the Ottoman Empire should be in alliance. And the Indian Muslims are using it, saying that the Caliphate, because of Tanzimat, show that Islam and modernity and civilization are compatible. I think what ended the Caliphate wasn't the Tanzimat. What ended the Caliphate is the extreme internationalization and usage of pan-Islamism and the Caliphate movement. We often forget that from 1918 to 1923, there is a global pan-Islamic movement. So Muslim internationalism actually peaks after Ottoman defeat. Turkish nationalists, Atatürk is part of it, but it's done by Enver, Jamal, Talat, and all the exiled young Turk. I mean, Enver Pasha dies in Central Asia, even though he's supported by the Bolsheviks. But they really scared the British. I mean, that's, I think, one of the reasons why the Turkish nationalists get a lot from the British in the Lausanne Treaty, much more than British initially wanted to give, because the Caliphate movement and the pan-Islamism put too much pressure and because of their fear and the geopolitical fear of the British is a lot. So there's an irony that Caliphate was abolished because of the success of the Caliphate movement. But I will correct that actually the Caliphate of Abdulhamid and post-Abdulhamid is a very secular caliphate in some ways. You try to put too much Islamic attribution. Obviously, people quote the Quran and the Hadith. It's secular on both ways, that the Indian Muslims loyal to the caliphate is relying on the British secularism. So the British secularism say that I run your political affairs, but I don't interfere in your religious affairs. And Indian Muslim says, okay, you don't interfere on my religious affair or my religious life, but because of my religious life, I need to be loyal to the emperor of another empire, right? I need to be loyal to the caliph. I mean, that must have given British a lot of anxiety. Like, what do you mean that it's your religious duty to be loyal to another emperor? I mean, that's very complicated. But Ottomans themselves, they are, they are sultan. They are the job description of Abdulhamid is to keep the empire. He's also the sultan of the Armenians and the Greeks and the Jews. And if you look at the details, it's less known outside of Turkey, but the Turkish historians know that the actual sultan who declared jihad against the British is not Abdulhamid, it's his successor, Mehmet Rashad. When a Bulgarian king was visiting him in 1913, in the palace, they served the king wine. I mean, this is very normal in the kind of diplomatic thing. But the wine came from the cellar of the palace. So that means that in the palace that the caliph was ruling, there were wine in the cellars. And we know that one caliph, the predecessor of Abdulhamid, he was kind of an alcoholic too. You can always say, these are Hanafis, wine is fine for them up to a certain degree. There's some sort of a legal justification. But some of these things are actually not known, how modern and secular that government by the Sultan, which was also at the same time a caliph. If you want even a scandalous example, it was the caliph's government in the fight against sexually transmitted diseases, allowed the establishment of prostitution houses so that they can go and inspect. So this is not the theocracy or a kind of a government that will strictly impose some sort of a notion of Sharia. I mean, Sharia, they're proud of it, they use it, but I think we need to understand what Caliphate meant, both internationally and in the Ottoman context, as a modern institution, and being always reinvented, repassioned in that global struggle of race and empire.
Well, we're getting close to the end of our time here. Cemil, there's a number of open questions. I'm not sure if any of them particularly appeal to you. Perhaps we could turn here to this question just posted by Karsten Wilke, which is, for you as a historian, what is the criterion of the Ottoman Empire's European membership or exclusion? Isn't there a risk of reifying Europe? There was no European Federation, criteria of political legitimacy changed often, and the Ottomans were generally part of international alliances and conferences.
Who's the person asking this question? I can't read this.
This is from Karsten Wilke.
I want to thank that person because it gave me a very good opportunity to say that maybe the Ottomans and the Turks who created Europe. I mean, that's, I think, one of the great ironies of both the late Ottoman, also the Turkish Westernism. I think there was a question about Turkey's Westernization. Turkey was invested in Western civilization in the 20s and 30s when Europe was ruled by fascists. It was a horrible racist empires all over the world. And imagine Europe in 20s and 30s, and that's the time when you want to Westernize and Europeanize. I mean, maybe until, especially post 1929. Turkey also invited Richard Kothaving Kalergi's, Hitler called him a bastard cosmopolitan, that cosmopolitan bastard. He's the father of pan-Europeanism. They invited him to Ankara to promote that Turkey could also be part of this vision of a pan-Europeanism. So I will say that the Turks were more interested in Europe before the European idea of a European Union took shape. Europe was a mess. But these are very ambiguous projects. The Ottomans were always part of Europe. I think Giancarlo Casale has some of really fascinating articles and points about. He's even suggesting that one of the first writing defining Europe as a continent, as a civilization, is actually done by an Ottoman, and praising Ottomans as the most important and most ideal European empire back in the 16th century. In the Ottoman case too, there is one question that I couldn't go into the detail, but it's in this paper and I wrote for this talk, is that the Ottoman attempt to defend itself through international law to justify, it relies on being the medium power, right? So you are always weak compared to Russia. The military balance and the budget balance is 1-4. The Ottomans could, when you think about it, they could never defeat Russia. They always needed Britain, like in the Crimean War, and that's still true that Turkey cannot deal with Russia as a threat. So I'm sure Erdogan and Putin know that balance of power question as well. And so they always needed Britain. With Britain, I mean, in the Crimean War, it wasn't only Britain, France, Kingdom of Sardinia, there were some sort of a liberal European alliance that came to support the Ottomans. And I think the Ottoman strategy was to use international law to defend the empire. There's a very good book on this by Arnold Becker, who actually argues that international law is a product of medium powers like Turkey. You can also include Japan, China, Argentina. They are interested in international law because with military power, you can bully people. You don't, like America. America doesn't need United Nations and the international law. They can just go invade a place and then make up justifications. It's the medium power that are more interested in international law. And in that sense, maybe the Ottomans put too much trust in Eurocentric international law. They put too much trust in concept of Europe. So they may have contributed to that idea of Europe. We definitely see, for example, with in the 20s and 30s, Europeans are really puzzled with Turkey's westernization. Like, what happened to this country that we hated as the Muslim enemy? And suddenly they abolished the Caliphate, they're westernizing, they changed their hat, and it must be confusing for the remaining Christians. I mean, whatever suffering they went through, they were in World War I, there were Christians in Turkey in the interwar period. And suddenly the way their clothing is standardized with the European hat. So who is a Muslim, who's a Christian in the street is not distinguishable. You won't know. That actually gives you a kind of space for equality in a society. Like the holidays are moved to Sunday. So if you're an Armenian and a Greek in Turkey, their numbers are small. Suddenly your religious day becomes the national holiday. You don't have to deal with that. So the question is really good. I hope someone will work on this, is that maybe the countries like Turkey is the one that actually contributed to the emergence of Europe. Then, it's being picked up after 1945. So the story of Kalergi is a very good story. He's a marginal figure, eccentric, who cares about pan-Europeanism in the 20s and 30s. But then suddenly after 45, 50, then both Churchill and Schuman show interest in him. And then some of these ideas are picked up by other people for very different purposes. And it seems like both Ottoman Empire and Turkey, Republican Turkey, contributed to the development of the idea of Europe with their own actions.
Thanks a lot, Cemil. And with that, I think we'll wrap it up and give a big thanks to Cemil for being with us today. And also thanks to you for joining us from wherever you are. This is the Center for Eastern Mediterranean Studies' last event of the spring, and we will resume activities in September and hope to see you again there, hopefully even in person in Vienna, like post-COVID human beings. So with that, I bid you adieu and look forward to seeing you in the future. Goodbye.
Well, thank you for this opportunity. This happened only with your invitation. I had to think about this question. So, you can always email me for the attendees. I appreciated your questions. I didn't get to answer all of them. I will try to read it. So I'm here now. I'm going to go through your questions, so without closing it. Thank you very much.